So the aim of this lecture is to introduce an interesting argument based on a paper by Greene from 1914, which creates all kinds of trouble for arguments in ethics. Now I want to start by stressing that I'm offering a loose reconstruction of that argument, by which I mean I'm not that interested in being faithful to Greene's own argument. I'm much more interested in having an argument which is correct, avoids unnecessary objections that have been raised to his argument, and establishes a significant conclusion. Now you mustn't think that this means that I'm somehow not a good fan of Greene, right? I'm really a good fan of Greene. You've got to think of this in the same tradition as I recently discovered, actually, as I was preparing this very lecture, I discovered a Mavado remix of Popcorn, Everything is Fine, which is a song, let's hear a second.
The exam stress and all of
the exam period. It's a beautiful thing, it's a beautiful thing. But of course Mavado, he's not trying to stay faithful to the original, he's trying to add something and remove something from it, simplifying it. So it's a remix, essentially. I'm trying to avoid premises about factors which are morally relevant in particular, because it seems to me there's an awful lot of debate about this, and we don't want to go there. We don't want to go there. It hasn't really helped us. We could spend a long time talking about that. I don't think we're going to get anywhere. And I think actually the argument shows why debate about which factors is morally relevant has encountered some problems. So here's the argument. It's a bit of a whopper, but we're going to go through it step by step. Let's start with the conclusion. So we're really interested in premises about particular moral scenarios. If you were with me last week for, Foote, Thompson, Cam, you'll see that they had lots of premises about, this trolley scenario is different from that trolley scenario, or it's okay to drop bombs in this situation, but not to drop bombs in that situation. So those are premises about particular moral scenarios. Now what you notice is that most of their premises are not justified, or if they are justified in some way, it's certainly not through any kind of inference. So I'm going to say they're not justified inferentially, those premises, which means either they're not justified or whatever justification they have doesn't involve inference. All right, that's clear enough. Now what you've got to note about the conclusion here is it's quite carefully formulated. So the claim isn't that there is necessarily something wrong with ethical arguments which rely on these not justified inferentially premises about particular moral scenarios. It's that we shouldn't use them if our aim is to acquire knowledge of the conclusions through the argument. But there may be other reasons why we want to construct such arguments. It may be that we're not aiming to use the arguments in order to gain knowledge of their conclusion. And in that case, our argument doesn't show that there's anything wrong with that. So why is this significant? Well, I take it that an awfully large number of ethicists across a wide variety of different traditions, so Railgun, Cam, Foote, Rawls, notably Rawls, do want to rely on not inferentially justified premises in their ethical arguments. And although the conclusion here is specifically about premises concerning particular moral scenarios, you'll see that our argument actually generalizes beyond that really quite nicely. So this is, I think, a useful simplification for us in working through it, but it will have very broad implications for how ethics is done. So if you have a strong commitment to ethics, this is going to be, I hope, interesting to you, because it suggests that most of the ethics that philosophers have been up to can't quite work in the way that it's often presented as working, as providing us with a route to knowledge. Can't do that. All right, so how does the argument go? First premise involves a dual process theory. So I'm going to explain what one of those is later. The crucial thing is that the dual process theory involves distinguishing fast from slow processes. It's dual, but the key thing is to get you past one, so it could be that there are many fast processes, that's fine. And the idea is that ethical judgments are a consequence of both fast and slow processes. So they are influenced by both processes, and one or another of those processes may dominate on any particular occasion. What comes next? Another premise, actually. The premise is that faster processes are unreliable in unfamiliar situations. There's a star here because that unfamiliar is a technical term that we'll come to later. So for now, let's just forget the technical term and imagine that premise can be understood in a sort of common sense way. So that's actually wrong and misleading, but it will help you to understand the reconstruction now. Okay, now if those two premises are true, then we shouldn't rely on faster processes in unfamiliar situations. So I take 3 to be trivially a consequence of 1 and 2. Good, good. Right, we're in agreement about that. Now, so far in the argument, we haven't actually applied this yet. So in the next bit of the argument, we're going to apply it to ethics. We're going to say that when philosophers rely on not justified inferentially premises, they're relying on faster processes. Now here the argument's going to be quite simple. What we're going to see is that there's nothing else that they could be relying on. It can only be the faster processes. Although the claim here, importantly, isn't that the faster processes are somehow directly causing the judgments. The faster processes are only indirectly responsible for these not inferentially justified premises. So watch out for that when we get there. Now, if you accept that, everything is still fine as far as the philosopher goes. We also need the fifth premise. We have reason to suspect that moral scenarios philosophers consider are unfamiliar situations. This, of course, is critical. And if you put those two things together with 3, you get the conclusion that I was advertising before. So where are we? I want 2 things to happen here. So first of all, I hope that you understand this argument, at least roughly. Secondly, what I would suggest is that the lecture is broken down into sections corresponding to the premises which are not inferential consequences, so 1, 2, 4 and 5. You don't need to look at all of those sections. Look at the sections where you have unclarity or where you have interesting doubts, where you think you might find an objection to the argument. So you can organise your time in that way. You don't necessarily have to go through it all sequentially unless you want to. So I hope you've understood the argument, and I hope you know how to use it to structure your use of the materials in this lecture. One last thing. As I'm developing this argument, I'm relying on a comparison between ethics and physics. I think if you accept that ethics and physics are comparable, the argument will work. We can fairly straightforwardly establish the conclusion of the argument, providing that you give us premise 1, and premise 1 is actually rather difficult to establish because it depends on a very large volume of evidence. So apart from premise 1, I think the argument's very straightforward. But of course, many people will object to the comparison between ethics and physics. So what I'm going to do in the notes, but not in the recordings because unfortunately it would make everything much too long. So in the notes, what I'm doing as a kind of bonus is considering what would happen if instead of comparing ethics with physics, we compared ethics with linguistics. And what you'll see from the notes, to cut a long story short, is that whichever comparison you make, you get to broadly the same conclusion. Slightly different routes, slightly different conclusions, but whether you think of this would correspond, comparing ethics to linguistics would correspond to a kind of meta-ethical view where the truths about ethics were really truths about the way that human minds work, roughly speaking, whereas this is a more Railgun, I guess, style view in meta-ethics. There are sort of ethical truths which are, in some sense, for us to discover. Comparison with physics would then work better. Now I'm kind of agnostic. You can do any comparison that you like. I put it to you that regardless of the comparison, you should arrive at roughly the same conclusion, providing our dual process theory of ethics is true. The important thing, I think, and what many researchers in this area are missing, is that you shouldn't treat ethics somehow as a special case. In other domains, there's a great deal that we have learned through history, through advances in science, or through advances in cognitive psychology. And we need to make use of all of those advances in other domains, linguistics, physics, mind reading, one of my favourite areas, numerical cognition. I think lots of that. We could actually do a comparison with colour cognition, although I'm not going to go that far. What's very important here is to draw comparisons and to exploit them, regardless of what you think is exactly the right comparison and why. That's much less important than the fact that you're using a comparison. In any case, in the development that I'm offering you in the recordings, I'm relying on the comparison of ethics to physics, or more carefully, ethical cognition to physical cognition. Let's go.